A big explosion in a northern Chinese city left buildings destroyed. People covered in blood were seen carried away in ambulances. China turns to the U.S. for help amid a power crisis. Beijing is set to double its import of natural gas from America. That's through deals with an American energy company. China's coal price tripled at its highest point. Authorities intervened, solving the problem for now, but they might have made another problem worse. The Boston Celtics Enes Kanter is calling out the Chinese regime's treatment of Tibetans. Celtics games are reportedly already being pulled in China. And Japanese companies are in the spotlight. One has been fined $100,000 by China. That's for choosing a wrong date for a new product launch. The other company is investing billions of dollars in the U.S. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. A gas explosion in a northern Chinese city wiped out almost an entire street. Footage from the scene shows buildings being smashed to the ground, and people covered in blood were carried away in ambulances. Local officials say the explosion happened at a restaurant.
At least 4 people were killed and dozens were injured in an explosion in northeast China's Shenyang city. The explosion originated from a restaurant Thursday morning. The shockwaves severely damaged nearby buildings. A bus was passing by when the explosion hit, and now only the metal frames remain. More than 10 passengers on board were injured. Official reports say it was a gas explosion.
A friend of mine happened to pass by the scene. He told me a lot of people were carried away on stretchers. Some have blood all over their bodies. Ambulances took many people away.
According to a Chinese media interview with a nearby shop worker, the bus was fully loaded with passengers. She said the shock waves pushed the bus almost 60 feet away. NTD cannot independently verify the death toll, but witnesses say the numbers could increase.
It was a big street during rush hour. Buses and private vehicles were busy moving.
Footage shows the explosion creating a mushroom cloud and dust particles covering cars and buildings nearby.
All passers-by, those not injured, got dust on their heads and bodies or broken glass.
The witness says broken window glass seems to fall from the sky at any time. All nearby shops and buildings are temporarily closed. Some residents doubt that a gas explosion can be this powerful. The neighborhood reportedly just finished renovating old gas pipelines. It's unclear whether the explosion is related to the renovations.
China's coal shortage has led to widespread power outages and soaring coal prices. Authorities intervened and coal prices dived, but the problem with power outages might be becoming worse. On Wednesday, some major coal producers in China said they would cap coal prices. That's after the Chinese regime published 3 articles the day before, asking state-owned enterprises to ensure a stable supply and price of coal and electricity at all costs. After the official announcement came out, coal prices fell across China with a maximum drop of 10%. 2 insiders say that more state-owned coal mining companies are about to launch price cap plans. Before this move, coal prices were soaring in China. In some areas, they even tripled the prices from last year. That's according to Chinese state media reports. While coal prices were rising, supply was declining. China's Statistics Bureau reported on Monday that coal production declined in September compared to August, and also dropped compared to the same period last year. A Chinese professor on commercial law says Beijing's intervention cannot cure the root cause, that capping coal prices is not a sustainable solution. He points out that coal companies are facing a dilemma. They aren't able to make profits due to low prices, but they still have to produce coal. Temperatures began to drop sharply in China in recent days, and the demand for more electricity may trigger an energy crisis. China is the world's biggest coal producer and consumer. Nearly 60% of the country's power plants rely on coal to generate power. Where can China turn to for help while in the throes of its energy crisis? It is turning to the U.S. Beijing is set to import more natural gas from America, more than double the current rate. This after Chinese state-run companies made long-term supply deals with one of the biggest U.S. gas producers, Venture Global LNG. According to a Financial Times report, from 2023 on, China's oil and gas giant Sinopec and its trading arm will get 5 million tons of liquefied natural gas per year from the American company. In comparison, last year, China imported only about 4 million tons of gas from the U.S. The deals seem to be good news for the communist regime, as the country's power squeeze is leading to blackouts both in factories and residential areas and hitting China hard. Now we turn to a Chinese spy. On Monday, a federal trial began in Ohio, a first of its kind. The Chinese defendant, named Xu Yanjun, is a deputy director of China's state intelligence agency. The U.S. accuses him of recruiting spies to steal aerospace technology from U.S. companies. He faces up to 15 years in prison if convicted. Local Cincinnati media WCPO9 News reports an FBI agent testified that one of Xi's 4 mobile phones had been remotely wiped, so agents found almost nothing. Xi is the first Chinese agent ever extradited to the U.S. He was arrested in Europe in 2018. Experts say the trial will force China to rethink the cost of spying. According to the indictment, Xi has targeted aviation companies worldwide since at least 2013. He recruited their employees, inviting them to make university presentations in China. But this isn't the only espionage or trade secret theft case in the U.S. involving China. The country is interested in a broad range of U.S. technologies, from biological to engineering. The Boston Celtics Enes Kanter is calling out the Chinese regime's treatment of Tibetans. He used words like brutal and cultural genocide. Reportedly, Celtics games are already being pulled in China. NTD's Don Ma has more.
The NBA could be in the hot seat again in China. Boston Celtics center Enes Kanter blasted Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping, calling him a brutal dictator.
Brutal dictator of China, Xi Jinping. I have a message for you and your henchmen. I will say it again, again, and again, loud and clear. I hope you hear me. Free Tibet, free Tibet, free Tibet.
Kanter tweeted the video before his Celtics-Knicks game on Wednesday. He criticized the Chinese Communist Party's treatment of Tibetans.
Tibetan monks, nuns, intellectuals, writers, poets, community leaders, activists, and many more have been detained, sent to political re-education classes, subject to torture, lengthy interrogations, and even been executed.
And during his game against the Knicks, he wore sneakers with the words "Free Tibet" emblazoned on them. He says Tibetans have no freedom in communist China.
They are not allowed to study and learn their language and culture freely. They are not allowed to travel freely. They are not allowed to access information freely. The Tibetan people are not even allowed to worship freely.
He says this is cultural genocide. He's seeing plenty of support on Twitter and Facebook, but not so much on Chinese social media platforms. On Weibo, it seems search results for the basketball player's name have been removed. Meanwhile, a fan page for the Boston Celtics with over 600,000 followers said it will stop updating its social feed. One Chinese netizen said, "I've been an old Celtics fan for more than 10 years. After Kanter did this, I won't support the Celtics team a single day longer." The Chinese Foreign Ministry even got involved. A spokesperson said that Kanter's message isn't worth refuting, but added that Beijing will not accept attacks that discredit Tibet. The fallout is reminiscent of a similar incident in 2019, where Houston Rockets executive Daryl Morey tweeted in support of pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. It led to state-run media CCTV boycotting NBA game broadcasts in China. Kanter is of Turkish heritage and has been vocal in the past on a range of political matters. Don Ma, NTD News.
The nominee for the next U.S. ambassador to China says the U.S. will continue to follow the One China policy, but also help Taiwan defend itself. Nicholas Burns also noted in his testimony to Congress that China is aggressive and untrustworthy. He said that on Wednesday before the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Burns insists that the U.S. should prioritize boosting Taiwan's defense against Beijing, saying our responsibility is to make Taiwan a tough nut to crack.
The PRC's genocide in Xinjiang, its abuses in Tibet, its smothering of Hong Kong's autonomy and freedoms, and its bullying of Taiwan are unjust and must stop. Beijing's recent actions against Taiwan are especially objectionable.
Burns added Beijing has no real allies and its power shouldn't be overestimated. Burns also said Washington is right to follow its One China policy on Taiwan.
But we're also right to support the peaceful resolution of disputes in this region and to oppose unilateral actions that undermine the status quo and undermine the stability of the region.
Under the One China policy, the U.S. cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan in 1979 and recognized Communist China as the only representative of the region instead. The nominee has been a career diplomat and used to serve as the U.S. ambassador to NATO, the military alliance between European countries, the U.S. and Canada. He is not expected to face significant opposition. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is targeting Beijing in its objectives.
Also part of the increased focus on China and how the rise of China has consequence for our security.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says an important part of the alliance's plans will include countering threats from Communist China. In Belgium on Thursday, Stoltenberg voiced NATO's concerns over China's cyber force, new technology, and long-range missiles, saying NATO's coming rulebook will thoroughly address those threats to European security. NATO has been focusing on Russia and fighting terrorism. According to a Financial Times analysis, its new focus reflects the U.S.'s geopolitical orientation shift from Europe to Beijing. Stoltenberg said NATO would scale up its domestic defense against external threats. That's as China invests heavily in NATO countries' critical infrastructure and comes increasingly closer with more long-range weapons. Last week, we covered Taiwan's official count of deaths after vaccination against COVID-19. Now, an explainer on Taiwan's vaccination data. Taiwan CDC updates its vaccine-related statistics daily. As of Wednesday, over 20 million shots have been administered, and reports of reactions after vaccinated climbed over 10,000, including over 900 deaths. These incidents occurred chronologically after vaccination, but Taiwanese authorities say there is no proof they happened because of vaccination.
The Taiwanese Ministry of Health and Welfare says
the number of adverse event reports alone cannot explain or be used to draw conclusions about the presence of, absence, severity, frequency, or incidence of vaccine-related problems and should be interpreted in the context of other scientific information. Currently, the rate of incident reports after vaccination is lower in Taiwan compared to other countries. In the UK, for example, the rate of reports per million doses is about 17, whereas in Taiwan, it's only 2. A Japanese electronics giant got a fine of over $150,000 in China for the date it chose to launch a new product. Sony Group's Chinese subsidiary got the fine over violations of China's advertising laws. It began this summer when the company announced it would hold a product launch event on July 7th. That's the anniversary of an incident in 1937 that triggered a war between China and Japan. Sony canceled its plan following backlash from Chinese netizens. But Chinese authorities still issued the fine last week, saying Sony's move hurt the dignity of the nation, and this is against China's advertising laws. Sony's fine is the most allowed under Chinese law for this kind of accusation. Economic interactions between the U.S. and Japan seem to be increasing. Japanese automaker Toyota is planning to invest more than $3 billion in the U.S. through 2030 to make automotive batteries. Toyota is the world's largest automaker by volume. The next plant aims to start production in 4 years. It's expected to create about 2,000 new jobs in America. Toyota's North America CEO Ted Ogawa said in a statement, the investment will help usher in more affordable electrified vehicles for U.S. consumers. Education is also a part of Chinese Communist Party warfare against foreign countries. A French senator says this threat is very serious in France, as the government spends much less money on protecting universities' independence than the CCP spends on infiltrating them. NTD correspondent David Vivez has the story.
Universities in France are vulnerable to influence by the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. That's according to Senator Étienne Blanc, who's part of a commission that measures CCP interference on French campuses. He said the Chinese regime efforts are underestimated and could pose a serious threat to the university's independence.
If we compare our means of defense with the Chinese means to exert Beijing's influence, China's means are really considerable. We have to find new ways to protect ourselves.
The senator quoted a 650-page military report released in September on Beijing's influence operations. The report highlights the continuous efforts of the CCP to use education as a form of warfare against Western countries. In 2018, a Chinese university director addressed teachers who would be sent abroad to Confucius institutes, saying their goal was to integrate the red DNA and spread it to future generations in Western countries. Aside from the institutes, there's another method of warfare that may be even more dangerous: the monitoring of Chinese students. In 2015, Chinese regime leader Xi Jinping said at a conference that Chinese students in foreign countries are a priority target for monitoring, and that they should be prevented from being infected by Western IDs. The military report quotes examples of different strategies used on Chinese students when they speak out against the CCP while abroad. The regime might have their parents arrested in mainland China or make them the target of cyberbullying campaigns by other students who work with the CCP. And the increasing number of Chinese students who attend universities in the US, Europe, Canada and Australia can be used as powerful leverage for warfare, according to the report. Senator Blanc says it's important to recognize the methods used and the threat of CCP in universities.
The CCP considers our system to be not good for people, for humanity. It constrains, forbids, threatens, and uses violence. For us, this is fundamentally incompatible with who we are. We think the opposite, that our system is good, that it protects people, that it protects humanity.
David Vives, NTD News.
Developers are defaulting. At least 4 more are added to the list after Evergrande. What's next? NTD's Evelyn Lee asked Daniel Lacaille, the chief economist at Tresses.
The problem with dollar bond defaults from Chinese property developers is getting worse, and a wave of debt will be due in the coming months. After Evergrande and Fantasia Holdings, at least 4 more Chinese developers defaulted or asked investors to wait longer for their repayment.
What we have now is the consequence of building for building's sake. White elephants, phantom cities, buildings without tenants.
Now investors everywhere are offloading high-yield bonds from Chinese developers. According to a China strategist at BCA Research, they're all worried about their ability to repay debts. There are also concerns that developers like Evergrande would prioritize paying suppliers and creditors in mainland China over offshore bondholders. China's central bank says Evergrande's spillover risks can be controlled, but Tresses chief economist Daniel Lacaille says it won't be able to solve the problem.
There are only 2 things that the central bank can do. One is to inject more liquidity, and the second is to provide rate cuts so that banks maintain the credit flow to the overall economy. That is okay, but it's not going to solve the problem of solvency of the real estate sector.
He says it will significantly impact other sectors that are connected to real estate and the level of growth of the real economy. The real estate sector makes up about 25% of China's GDP. And Lacaille says the magnitude of the bubble in China is significantly larger than the subprime crisis. On Wednesday, Chinese developer Modern Land said it has liquidity issues. China Properties Group defaulted, and so did Cynic Holdings.
A property bubble has very severe implications on other sectors and on the financial sector, regardless of the country, be it China or the United States.
And the pressure is mounting. Goldman Sachs says more than $6 billion of debt is maturing in January. At the same time, sales for many developers fell by 30%, a slowdown that's likely to continue. Evelyn Lee, NTD News.
Swedish car brand Volvo said on Monday its initial public offering would be priced at up to $23 billion. That would likely make it one of the biggest listings in Europe this year. Volvo is currently owned by a Chinese company.
Volvo Cars says an upcoming share sale will value it at up to $23 billion. That's after it set a price range for the IPO on Monday. The Swedish brand is owned by Geely. Under the Chinese firm's stewardship, it spent years strengthening its foothold in the premium market. Now its shares are set to start trading on October 28th. Chief Executive Håkan Samuelsson says there is strong interest, especially from Nordic investors. Views on the valuation may depend on the success of Polestar. That is the electric car brand co-owned by Geely and Volvo, which is set to list shares in a separate transaction. Volvo says its own share listing should raise $2.9 billion to help fund its future development plans.
And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you next time.